Happy Thursday, everyone. Um, as you can see, yeah, Brian said I have quite a few projects going on. You can find me most places around the web as 5T3PH. And here's a couple of my projects that I work on quite a bit, and with Eleventy.rocks being most pertinent to our topic today. My first question for you today is, do you enjoy being a maker of the web? For myself, enjoyment is strongly what got me into this industry. Now, it should be noted that my gateway into web development was Macromedia Flash. As soon as I wanted to publish my creation, I had to start learning about the other bits. And at that time, that meant manual FTP, fiddling with cPanel, and configuring DNS with a hope and a prayer. Within a few years, I found WordPress and spent over 10 years with it as a freelancer and a marketing developer. But then I wanted to do more. I wanted to create web apps and make them interactive client side. And I wanted to move beyond jQuery, which I had quite a proficiency in, thank you very much. But when I went to figure that out, the landscape was daunting. I knew what I wanted to do, but I struggled to put tools together to get there. My career took a bit of a turn when I suddenly found myself as a React developer, after taking the opportunity to lead development of a design system. And as part of that work, I created a Gatsby site to host our docs. React made sense to me because I had begun componentizing my work in WordPress. I wanted to share a bit of my history as a maker of the web because it strongly influenced how I approach and use Eleventy. But at this point, you may be thinking I've gone a bit off course, so we'll bring it back in and review some key features of Eleventy. First, I was very drawn to it being able to be purely static. At its most essential level, it can be a drop-in replacement for tools like Gulp and can be built with good old HTML and CSS. A huge selling point for me was that there is zero boilerplate client-side JavaScript. Eleventy includes browser sync when using the serve flag, which provides hot reload as you make changes. There's also full console logging output of what has changed or had errors, and the option to quiet that. Technically, the only requirement besides Eleventy is an index file, which can be created in any of the languages. Mine is usually Markdown that feeds into a nunjucks layout, which we'll talk about in a bit. Once you get a feel for how things work, you can begin to add your own opinions by updating the config, which is expected to be a root file called .eleventy as a JavaScript file. Here you can do things like customize your input and output directory, add other watch directories, and it's the entry point for plugins where you'll hook in additional templating, data, and content features. With 10 templating languages available, an early realization I had was that I could repurpose some of my organization preferences from both my React and WordPress days to create templates and components. I've grown a preference for a stack of HTML, nunjucks, and Markdown. The extra languages are a nice to have and can be added in as you find a need for them. As I mentioned, my preferred stack is HTML, nunjucks, and Markdown, but here you can see the full list of currently available templating languages. The first aha moment that I had that got me really excited about building with Eleventy was the ability to mix templating languages. This takes two primary forms. One being to mix in the same file, for example, nunjucks with Markdown, or mixing between layouts, such as a Markdown file that uses a nunjucks template layout. Layouts are special templates that can be used to wrap other content. An example of this is having an index Markdown file that contains your homepage text and front matter for the page title, and have it point to the layout of base, which is a nunjucks file. And in there, we have an HTML5 boilerplate that uses template tags to display the title value and the Markdown content. Eleventy also has a feature called layout chaining. So you could create an article content type and a news content type that both chain to a page layout. And the page layout could chain to the base layout. With layouts and templates, you can use the syntax of the language you choose to include other files as partials, or you can create reusable content with shortcodes and manipulate content with filters. We don't quite have time to go through those features today, but the key point here is that they allow even more customization and flexibility within your layouts and templates. And you can review that info by visiting the Eleventy docs about configuration. One of the most powerful features related to templating is being able to define overrides of the template engine, which you can do per file or in the Eleventy config. On a per file basis, we can place it in front matter. Here, we define that the template should first be consumed as nunjucks, then markdown. Eleventy will work for basic loops that mix languages, but adding filters or formatting can sometimes cause issues that the template engine override will resolve. The example that was just shown was actually set up to use what Eleventy calls custom data. An optional directory can be included called _data, and in there you can put things like JSON or JavaScript modules. The name of that file is then made available throughout Eleventy to access that data. So in the featured person example, there's a file located in the data directory called people, and that exports a simple array, which we can then access in any template by the file name of people. But you're not restricted to flat or simple local data. You can also perform a fetch for external data and import any needed functionality to get and format the data you want Eleventy to use. Here's a simple example, fetching a path from a random cat picture API. The important note here is that fetch is done at build time, not client side. For fetching from a CMS, this is highly desirable. But for content you want to keep more fresh, you can use services like if this, then that to do a periodic request if your site host supports webhooks to trigger a build. Of course, this is a static site limitation and not unique to Eleventy. We'll talk a bit more about data handling when we get to our examples. A key feature for content in Eleventy is collections. If you come from the WordPress world like I do, you can think of these similar to how adding tags creates sets of content. In fact, Eleventy uses the same convention of tags as one way to create a collection. Tags can be added in front matter, either as a single string or as an array. But the slickest way is to create a directory data file. The directory data file needs to be named the same as the directory and can be either JSON or JavaScript. It can hold any values that you would otherwise have to repeat in front matter for all related content. So in this example, located in our post directory, we create post.json and define the tags as well as the layout. Now we can access the post collection within any of our templates. As we saw with the data example that used Axios for fetching, another benefit of Eleventy is that it is built with Node, and you can use anything in the Node and JavaScript ecosystem at build time. Let's take a look at a classic issue that is solved by having access to JavaScript at build time, making sure your footer has the correct copyright year. In Eleventy, we could export this data, but we can also create what is called a shortcode to be able to output it. This snippet actually comes direct from my Eleventy.rocks config samples and likely looks very familiar to those of you who frequently write JavaScript. This snippet gets placed in the config, and then you can use it in your templates. There's also a fledgling plugin ecosystem. Plugins come in as packages and are included via the config as well. They range in complexity, but most provide access to shortcodes, filters, or other types of transforms that have the advantage of already being aware of how Eleventy works. A bonus benefit of my journey with Eleventy was finally publishing a package, since I wanted to release an Eleventy plugin, and now I have two. The best way currently to discover all Eleventy plugins is to search by the tag Eleventy-plugin on NPM. I'm hoping you've heard a few things that have you interested in Eleventy, but this next feature is what opened the door to the examples I'll be sharing shortly. By default, Eleventy works as you would expect from other similar static site generators. You create a file, and it ultimately outputs HTML. But Eleventy, by way of defining permalinks, allows you to change the file type and place the resulting file anywhere in the system. A small example of this being useful is in creating the site's RSS feed, which is actually demonstrated by the official Eleventy starter and supported by an official plugin, which provides some filters to assist in producing things like absolute URLs and correctly formatted dates. An additional way to use this feature is to be able to create a JSON file of page data that is actually constructed within a Nunjucks template and accesses an existing collection. The benefit of this is that you have the compiled template content available if, say, the content was created in Markdown. And using permalinks, we can both change it to be the JSON file type, but also place it outside of the input directory, thus excluding it from site output, but making it available for other processes. What I've just described is how I was able to create a dynamic and synced data file that is used to create social media images. In that process, I kicked the JSON file to a functions directory in which there's a Puppeteer script that loops through that data, loads it in an HTML template, and takes a snapshot to save the image. Before we move on to examples, I wanted to note that despite Eleventy being just about 3 years old, there's an active, passionate community. Search the phrase "built with Eleventy" on Twitter, and you'll get enthusiastic folks telling you all about it, often with a blog post about their experience. Where some platforms have the concept of themes, Eleventy uses the term starter, and there's a growing collection to choose from. With 11 templating languages available, there are many opinions of how things should be done, so you're sure to find something to help you get off the ground. The market for content about Eleventy is still young, which I find exciting and have personally embraced. But when you really can't find the answer, you can tag the official Eleventy account on Twitter, and Eleventy's creator, Zach Leatherman, will often answer or RT for reach to the community. He's also quick to amplify blog posts and other things made by and for Eleventy if you tag the account. Okay, so I hope you're excited and maybe even have a project in mind to try to build with Eleventy. So now we're going to build an Eleventy site in 3 minutes and see some of the features we talked about in action. We'll follow this with some examples of going beyond static with Eleventy. The first important lesson after we init a new project and get ready to install Eleventy is that it is a scoped package. So you'll install it with @11ty/11ty. Once the install completes, we'll open the package and update the default scripts section. We'll add a start command to run Eleventy with hot reload, which is provided by browser sync and part of the serve directive. Next, we'll create a config file to perform an optional step, which is to update our input and output directory. My preference being source for input and public for output. Then we need to create a layout file and an index file. You can certainly combine these steps, but to take full advantage of templating features, I recommend using layouts from the start. Eleventy expects layouts to be located in the includes directory, and we'll create a Nunjucks file called base. Our layout will use the HTML5 boilerplate, and we'll prepare it for the incoming content by adding the variable of title, which will be provided by front matter, and step out a nice semantic starting point by again adding the title as the H1, and use the template variable of content along with the safe filter to say we expect and want any HTML content here. Now in our source, we'll create our index markdown file and add the front matter key of title with a nice hello world and a small message to make sure our content is working. We'll also attach it to our layout with the front matter key of layout and set the value to the file name of base.njk. Finally, we'll open terminal and run the start command, which launches a local server. We do still have to open this in the browser ourselves, but you can see that we've successfully created our first page. We'd like a little style for this, so we'll add style.css. And the one trick here is that we need to make Eleventy aware of the CSS file, as it's not presently included. But first, we'll go back into our base template and link to our style sheet. Then, back in our config, we'll add style.css as a pass-through copy. And now we have a lovely sans serif theme kicked off. I said this was 3 minutes and we have about 40 seconds left. So let's create a blog. We'll create a post directory and add my first post with a title and a bit of content. Then we'll add a directory data file using the directory name as the file name, so posts. And we'll use this to send it to the base layout and also add tags to create the posts collection. Back in our index, we'll loop over the new post collection and you'll see everything updating as I add a second post. And there we have the essential basics of getting started with Eleventy. Let's return to the question I asked in the beginning, because, well, I'll be honest. After about 13 years out here, I was feeling a bit trodden down, particularly as a front-end focused developer. But Eleventy brought my spark back. With Eleventy, I can go from idea to publish in a matter of hours with only the speed of typing in my way. It's made me feel the magic of web development again. So I'd like to share some of those projects as examples of going beyond static with Eleventy, which to me means using the features we discussed to their full capability, to extend beyond just HTML output being produced from static local content. My first bigger project with Eleventy was stylestage.dev, which is a modern CSS showcase styled by community contributions. The key here is that anyone can contribute a style sheet. The way that is set up is by allowing contributors to add their own JSON file within the data directory that we talked about. Those then get globbed together to create a collection for use on the site. And also, a JSON file is created to generate the social share images. Eleventy, in this instance, enables a simple mechanism for contributors that doesn't require managing a CMS or worried about other forms of authorization because GitHub is handling that layer. Coupled with Netlify, any new PR gets deployed to its own branch, which enables me to review submissions to ensure they meet the guidelines and also help work with the contributor to resolve any issues or bugs. This has enabled contributors of many skill levels, and there are over 50 styles available to review on the site today. Next, we'll go a bit more outside the box with a series of generators that are intended to produce an asset or provide an environment instead of a static site for publish. First up is the example of an email generator. In this case, front matter is heavily leveraged to populate areas of the table-based template layout, but Markdown is used for the main content. The generator is set up to allow initial email styling with Sass. And with the build command, the compiled template content is fed through a filter that hooks in the juice package, which provides the style inlining functionality that is required for the best email style compatibility. So the output in this case is the compiled email template. But during the build, Eleventy provides a comfortable environment where I can tuck away the fact that ultimately an email is comprised of table layout. This year, I also started learning about web components, but I found them a bit uncomfortable to build as a hobbyist who was looking for a couple small use components versus building a whole system. I thought I might not be able to accomplish compiling a web component with Eleventy, but 2 hours later, I had a proof of concept deployed. The resulting environment allows generating web components in a way that separates concerns and enables including them in pages to test the component during build-out. To accomplish this, the generator exploits the layout functionality to inject the web component scripts and styles into the required location to create the final JavaScript file. The web component's HTML template is created as a nunjucts file, and the associated scripts and styles are created in the includes, as if they were layout partials. To dynamically tie it together, the generator expects that the nunjucts template and the directory for the scripts and styles share the same kebab-cased file name. Any web component is then fed into a unified components nunjucts template, and this allows bringing all the pieces together to be ready for what is ultimately output as a JavaScript file, ready to be used as a web component. In this case, the site could theoretically both create and consume those web components if the author so desired. Since this is still a proof of concept, there's plenty of room to improve by adding a transpiler or enabling Sass in addition to vanilla CSS. Next up is probably my most unusual idea to date. One area of CSS I hadn't had the opportunity to explore until recently was Houdini. When I went to try to understand it better, I found many wonderful resources, but no existing starting environment to build from. In the case of CSS Houdini, it is actually a requirement to be running on a secure or local server. The file used for Houdini is called a worklet and is created with JavaScript. There are a few flavors of Houdini available, but currently the best supported version is the Paint API. This API will look familiar to those of you who've worked with Canvas. And a disclaimer here, everything I just said and I'm about to show you was new to me, so there's ample room for improvement. Presently, this generator is set up to create only one worklet, because ultimately the idea is that the produced files can be published as a package to be available for wider consumption. However, it could be extended to create a set of related worklets. For this generator, the worklet is created all in itself, unlike the email or web component generators, which compile files together. But Eleventy helps provide the local server and the base template to serve the worklet, as well as the currently required polyfill to enable testing. Plus, since Eleventy runs on Node, we already have a package available, so it made it easy to prepare as an all-in-one solution to publish the final package from. For this generator, the benefit of Eleventy was providing a slim environment that provided the required local server and no extra fluff beyond that. Cool. So we've talked about features inherent to Eleventy that allow us to do things beyond generate a simple static site. But what if you do need some client-side JavaScript? For most of my projects, I either really don't need JavaScript or a small enough bit that I could write it vanilla with no worries about compatibility. But then I had the idea for a client-side generator that I really needed to include functionality from available packages. And this next screen has a little bit of flashing in case you have sensitivities for that. My web app, ButtonBuddy, helps you check or create an accessible color palette for your buttons. And the main package I needed to include was to do the calculations to determine the contrast ratio. With this project, I learned there were many ways folks were adding bundling or transpiling. But personally, I was familiar with Parcel from projects in my previous work life. So here I need to give credit to Michelle Barker, who created the Eleventy Parcel Starter, which was a beautifully slim setup that hooked into Parcel minimally at the last step of the build process. Within no time, I was able to add in the necessary bits to my in-progress project, and I was off to the races using ES6 and all the goodness with that for ease of putting together the web app functionality. Did I mention Eleventy has a great community? I wanted to include this example in case you have had concerns that Eleventy was going to lock you into only static without an easy plan to include modern client-side JavaScript when you really needed it. As I mentioned, I do have a history with React and Gatsby, and I'll say that Eleventy and Parcel got me precisely what I needed in a very efficient manner. I really hope some of the examples today have given you a spark of an idea that has you excited to be a maker of the web. Eleventy has given me a bit of a can't stop, won't stop attitude toward building for my own joy of the craft of web development. And these mini projects have been amazing for learning new things, getting feedback, and growing my network and connections to a whole new community of awesome web makers. So, whether you're looking for a replacement for an older setup, but otherwise content with truly static, or you're interested in upgrading your playground environment and exploiting some of the other features we talked about today, I encourage you to give Eleventy a try. To wrap up, I'll show you one last project, which is my site, Eleventy Rocks, and we're going to go ahead and publish the slides and notes from today's talk as a new post. So I have it loaded up here. You can see this is a markdown template. This site is hosted by Netlify, and I'm living dangerously, really dangerously apparently, too dangerously. I will be posting that shortly on Netlify, and it will be published very quickly thanks to Netlify's build robots going in the background. So shortly that will be available at Eleventy.rocks. And it's been a pleasure sharing about Eleventy today. And I think we're ready for questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was amazing. Honestly, it's just what I love. My favorite part was you had a countdown timer, and people were like, "Oh, that's great touch." And I'm like, she's presenting this live. It's not recorded, so that's risky. You were braver than I, for sure.
I think my bigger challenge was the bandwidth. Hopefully that came across okay.
Oh, yeah. Everything was great. So we did have some questions here from the audience. First one is, how does Eleventy compare to Gatsby?
Great question. I mean, the standout difference would be that Gatsby by default, and granted, I've been away from it for 6 or so months, so maybe things have changed a little bit that I'm not aware of, but is that the part about there being 0 client-side JavaScript. So there's no hydration that happens. By default, when you create an Eleventy project, it is truly static, just HTML, and whatever else you add is entirely up to you.
Yeah, for sure. I've used them both, and Eleventy is I mean, they're quite different. They have very different approaches. Obviously the React piece is big, but I find also like the plugin architecture and things like that are also quite different as well. Okay, next one. This is not about Eleventy, but it is the second most popular question that's been brought up on the chat a couple of times. Just notice your outfit matches your slides. Was this deliberate or just coincidence?
I had to fleet this, as the kids say. I found this in the back of my closet and then realized, oh my gosh, I've been accidentally designing like my wardrobe. I have a different site that the style stage also happens to match a shirt in my closet. So I guess I just like this color. They both have this color in common.
Okay,
I'm not a fashionista.
Well, it worked out because there was this, obviously we were impressed by your presentation, but it was a number of people who were like, wow, that's great. She matches her slides. So next question, does Eleventy include Parcel or is it left up to you to choose a bundler?
Great question. Yep, that part's entirely up to you. So by itself, you have the rest of the build process. Like I said, it has browser sync, so it's giving you that server, and it's doing the compilation of all your template files. So all those template languages you don't need to install separately, for example. All of that compilation is available. But using Parcel, I know some folks have used Webpack as well. That would be an add-on that you add into the process.
Okay. And so I have a question for you because it's something that I find interesting. So my feeling is Eleventy sits there somewhere in between what some people call like traditional static site generators, like the Hugos and the Jekylls of the world, and then I don't know there's a term for it, but the Gatsbys and Next.js and so on. I mean, what do you think is kind of the key difference between Eleventy and these other more traditional SSGs, or Eleventy and say the obviously we've already discussed Gatsby, but the other more framework-based SSGs?
Great question. I think, and the only other one I have experience with is Gatsby. So, and obviously those are, as we kind of already said, kind of opposite ends of Jamstack, as it were. And so I think, as with anything, right, your tech stack comes down to kind of preferences, skills, and I would say the same is still true when looking at these. I have heard that Eleventy also has a speed advantage, which I think has been proved out a few times. But other than that, I'm not quite sure. I can't personally directly compare it to like a Jekyll, for example.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, I'd say from my limited experience, I haven't used Eleventy a ton, but the JavaScript frameworks make it a little bit easier to pull in APIs at build time. Like, so if you have content you need to pull in and do that at build time, it's a little bit easier that way. But that's again, from my limited experience as well. I haven't used them all, but okay. So other questions from the audience. So I guess for Eleventy, no one needs to write a ton of vanilla JS code. How do you see the future of static website generators? I guess it's more of like a general, like, where do you see tools like Eleventy and other static site generators going? What would you like to see out of them in the future?
Great question. For myself, I think the challenge is I love talking about it and using it for personal projects. But I haven't had the experience of I've had experience using Gatsby in a team. And like you said, since you have React and it's kind of predicated on lots of plugins giving you lots of functionality, it's kind of a little easier to bring in functionality. Eleventy, I think we're starting to see that performance folks are wanting to have easier ways to ensure the performance of what they're building out. So I personally find it exciting. My other thing is CSS. So anytime we can go back to get as close as we can to fundamental web technologies, which Eleventy allows, and is why I love it, I think the better. But I think the team environment and the scalability come into play. And again, I can't quite speak to that, at least with Eleventy.
Yeah. Okay. So next question is, how do you solve the build and deploy portion of using Eleventy to have updates compile quickly? I guess it sounds like you haven't had issues with the updates not compiling quickly, but how are you deploying all these to Netlify and just having it build that way, or?
Yeah, I am. I would say the most complicated one, the longest build process I have right now, is the style stage, and that's because because it has to do that extra step of kind of globbing together disparate JavaScript files or JSON files. And then it also takes a little longer because this isn't Eleventy's fault. This is part of my build process. I'm also creating the social share images. So that part's actually what's taking up more of my build time than Eleventy itself. Eleventy itself, I think 20 seconds is maybe my longest build time, both locally or on the pipeline. So I have not seen, I know Zach Leatherman, I mentioned as a creator, I think he has some resources out there where it's been stress tested, and I'm sure other folks have stress tested it as well at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And Ray did talk about, like, he's got 6,000 blog posts being built by Eleventy. So it's crazy. I guess it can handle big sites full of cat photos. So another question that I had for you, well, actually, one more came in from the community here. Do you think Eleventy will compete with other static site generators by having their features like image optimization outputs? And I guess this is a lot, again, comparing to Gatsby, which has a lot of these plugins and things to handle things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That one specifically, Zach, I think just last week, released a pretty comprehensive image plugin. I haven't had the opportunity to use it yet, just because my own sites aren't image heavy. I believe it helps convert to even a VIF, or however we're saying that format, some different things. So the opportunity to add more plugins is going to give you a similar experience as using Gatsby or some of these other tools, where you can easily bring in those things. And again, you can bring in anything from NPM as well and plug it in as your own functionality.
Right.
So I have to personally remember that because I wanted to bring in some content from an RSS feed, for example. And at first I started down the path of how am I going to build this myself? And then, oh yeah, I can use a package and it's going to do it at build time, which is exactly what I want it to happen. I don't want it to be client side. So just kind of getting more familiar with the environment and remembering that you're not closed off from those other tools that you may be familiar with to help create your site or application.
Yeah, and I know, speaking of image optimization specifically, is you mentioned, I think before, that Zach is a big proponent of performance on web apps, and so So I know whatever kind of things like that would benefit the performance on on the browser of your web app. I'm sure he's gonna work that in. So yeah, I mean, even if one of the things is interesting about Eleventy is they have that list of sites that actually, or isn't it? It's ordered by your Lighthouse score or something like that, isn't it?
Yep, and a whole separate Speedlify that you can see that.
Yes,
Sites
right.
and
I've heard about that.
starters.
Right. So I'm going to ask, one more question for me. So Eleventy, one of the interesting things about Eleventy is there's been like the community around it is probably one of the more passionate of the tools out there in the Jamstack world. What makes you think? Why do you think people are so like passionate? I mean, even Ray, when I talk about it, Ray argues with me, always trying to convince me that I have to convert everything to Eleventy. So, why do you think people like Ray are so passionate about it?
In my own narrow lens of folks talking about it, it seems to be folks like myself who have a little bit of veteran status on the web. Like I said, I've been personally 13 years, right? And we're kind of eager, again, to go back to those fundamental technologies, where it's appropriate. I think just having the option in and of itself is exciting. I think that some of the other tools maybe haven't quite kept up to pace, or maybe don't offer the ease of hooking other functionality like Eleventy does. The part of bringing in plugins or Node, in terms of like Gulp or some of these things. There's a little bit of it being the new shiny, but
Yeah.
I think the flexibility of it to recognize that you can go beyond static is exciting too, and it's fun to have a playground as much as anything. So I think there's a little bit of play at work. I think the healthy competition of the performance stats and also being able to get really, produce what you want to do, but still use, just HTML and CSS to get there is pretty awesome. But also still have the benefits of templating when you need it.
Yeah, it seems like it's something. It's a tool that does whatever it is you need it to do, but only what you need it to do. So it's not like you're having to pull in, learn all kinds of new technologies or frameworks or anything like that. You just, it does what you need it to do, right? So.
Yep, you can layer up as you go, which is great too.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any more questions from the audience, but I mean, my video froze. Hello.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay. Video froze. Okay. Well, at least you can hear me. This is part of life. I got kids home on the internet, sucking it up for their virtual school. So it must be something going on with my connection here. So sorry about that. All right. So I was just going to do the outro, but thank you, Stephanie. That was fantastic. You can't see my excitement because I'm frozen, but I am excited because that was a really great presentation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come out and present to us and answer everybody's questions.